Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Cassie Riva. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm so pleased to introduce this virtual event with Arline T. Geronimus, presenting her new book, Weathering: The Extraordinary Stress of Ordinary Life in an Unjust Society, joined in conversation by Linda VIllarosa. Thank you for joining us virtually tonight. You can find our full event schedule at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and shop our shelves from home. Tonight's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk, click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. This event also has auto-generated closed captioning available. Depending on the version of Zoom you're using, you may need to enable captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption button on your screen. You can also disable captions there. In the chat, I'll be posting a link to Weathering on harvard.com. Your purchases truly make events like today's possible and help ensure the future of a landmark independent bookstore. And finally, as you've no doubt experienced, in virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you for your patience and understanding. And now I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speakers. Arline T. Geronimus is a professor in the School of Public Health and research professor at the University of Michigan, where she is affiliated with the Center for Research on Ethnicity, Culture, and Health. She's also an elected member of the Institute of Medicine on the National Academies of Science. Joining her on our digital stage tonight is Linda VIllarosa, contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine, where she covers the intersection of race, inequality, and public health. Her book, Under the Skin: The Hidden Toll of Racism on American Lives, was named one of the New York Times 10 best books of 2022. Arline's new book, Weathering, offers a shining light on the insidious effects of social injustice on the body and offers a roadmap of hope. National Book Award winner Ibram X. Kendi says one of the most significant public health research discoveries of the last few decades is this: when it comes to health and aging, how society treats us has more of an impact than how we take care of ourselves. In this monumental book, Arline T. Geronimus meticulously demonstrates that systemic injustice isn't just oppressive, it's toxic on the body. We're so pleased to be hosting this event tonight. The digital podium is yours, Arline and Linda.
Well, first, thank you very much. Arline, I'm just going to say a little bit of a, wonderful thing about you is, I cover race and health. I've covered it for a long time. And I always wanted something like Weathering to help me understand the things I was covering. So when I met you in, I think, 2017, as you know, I was a New York Times Magazine reporter and you're a researcher. And sometimes those conversations can be a little stiff and worrisome about how you're going to be quoted, et cetera. But you were wonderful to me and explained your theories clearly. Your theories have been foundational for me and useful in all of my work. And I'm very grateful to you and everything you've done. So thank you. And one more thing, I'm really proud of you for getting a book done. Writing a book is hard. I wrote a book. I know it's hard. I'm a professional writer, so I know it wasn't easy for you, but your book turned out wonderfully. And I'm happy that it's out there now. So I want to start with, if you could just I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about Weathering. There's a lot of gratitude for having, the concept in the world. So can you just briefly say what it is?
It's a structurally rooted, chronic, social, psychological, and environmental process that activates biological processes in the body that over time wear down people's health and ages them prematurely.
Got you. And I remember when you said something like that to me, and I'm basically a science reporter, and I was like, okay, wait a minute, wait, what is that? And I said, somebody like me how would I be weathered? I work in a university system. I'm one of the only Black professors. I grew up in an all-white community. And I said to you, give me an example of how that might happen to someone like me. Do you remember how you broke it down?
I can't say I remember from that specific conversation, but I can break it down again.
Okay.
The biological processes that are activated in the body are ones that lead to physiological stress arousal and vigilance. And the vigilance can be to actual physical harm, but it can also be to managing your social identity in public. So in a systemically racist society, while weathering among more affluent, educated people may not be as severe, you're not immune to it because there's still the vigilance. And in some ways, there's more vigilance when you're the one Black professor, the one Black family in the neighborhood. People, when you have to respond to knowing that in the air, people think you might be there as an affirmative action case, or you're just less intelligent because of your race. And so that you're always on a chronic level of vigilance to how you present yourself and how people are receiving how you present yourself. And that chronic vigilance activates this physiological stress arousal that over time will harm your health across all your body systems.
Okay, so break it down even further. So something happens and, like me or someone else who is, it happens to us chronically, someone says something or does something. And, I've offered one of my students who was like always stopped by the police. And each time I think of him and it breaks my heart. What is happening to his body at that time? He stopped by the police for no reason and then later let go. So what happens in those instances when he has to face that unfairness?
He obviously becomes very vigilant and very concerned about controlling his behavior. He's probably even been socialized and taught by his loving parents to behave in certain ways. But meanwhile, he knows that the reason he's doing that is there's some chance this is going to end up being a fatal confrontation for him. And so he's actually in a kind of what many people think of as fight or flight mode, even though he's trying to stay calm and polite, despite the fact that through his body, there are now stress hormones raging that in turn elevate his blood pressure, elevate his heart rate, catapult sort of oxygenated blood towards his heart and other large muscles, as you would if you were needed to fight or flee. And meanwhile, they're also mobilizing glucose, sugars, and fats into his bloodstream for energy. And they're at the same time not sending oxygenated blood or nutrients to a variety of organs in his body that are not needed to help you fight or flee. And if you're pregnant, a fetus is a drag on your system if you're in fight or flight mode. So you may lose the fetus if you're terrorized enough, go into preterm birth. But even if it doesn't get that bad, the lack of nutrients to your fetus and oxygen will lead to growth retardation or low birth weight and other poor birth outcomes. And when this is happening chronically from getting every fist in your face, whether it's objective environmental or whether it's because of environmental racism or whether it's fears of the police or actual interactions with the police, or just anticipating them and then also ruminating about them afterwards. All these things, along with all the ways you're working day and night to deal with, say, material hardship, or to prove, if you're a professor, that you're just as smart and productive as everybody else, this leads your body to be in this chronic state of stress arousal. So you're depriving some parts of your body of nutrients. You're over activating other parts of your body. So for instance, your heart can become enlarged, like any muscle that's pumped too much. The blood and sugar stays in your arteries, and does all the thing we know happen, or we think happen from eating the wrong things, but it actually can happen, and happen more often and more insidiously through this stress process, wearing away at your arteries, sending plaque throughout your body. You've also engaged your immune system, so you have white blood cells running rampant to help you out, so that if you were, say, mauled by a lion, they will help you survive the injuries if you didn't die. And so the white blood cells also form plaques. They can start leukemias, and all your body organs and systems start to get worn down a little more and a little more with all these different stressors day in and day out. And then you're susceptible to all the diseases and conditions that marginalized American, in particular Black Americans, experience at much greater rates than white Americans.
Mm-hmm. And tell us how, I think that you're calling this concept weathering is very poetic. Tell us how you came up with that word, weathering.
Right. Well, I did initially think of it as a metaphor before I had put all the pieces together. And I liked the word weathering and thought it was apt because it points to the two sides of what erodes the body over time. One part is literal erosion from exposure, the way a rock might be weathered by constant rain. And that side of it, many people find somewhat intuitive, that people who are exposed to more and more harmful things will, that can weather them. But the other side of it for me that I think is often missed is that people who are subjected to weathering of the exposure kind and all the stressors don't just lie down and give up. They try to withstand those stressors. They try to weather the storm. They work harder. They actively, effortfully cope with, they take the 3 jobs to barely make a living that require them to lose sleep and be on buses half their day, and so they can put food on the table. They argue with the landlords who aren't, giving them working heat in the winter. They take on the bureaucracies. They go to college and deal with all the, strangeness of college culturally for them, and all the code switching and identity management. Those things are weathering too. So that kind of active, effortful coping is both shelter and storm. And it's an important part of weathering and how structural racism affects health, even for people who we would see as working hard and playing by all the rules, to use that cliche.
You know what? I remember when I was talking to you and I said, I think I just said this thing. I go, is weathering a Black thing? I said those words. So can you explain how you would answer me if I say that?
Again, okay. Yes and no. It is not an essential Black thing. It has nothing to do with genetics. It has nothing to do with culture. It is a human biological process that does and would erode the health of members of any social identity group that are exploited, oppressed, suffer racism or homophobia or xenophobia. There are many other examples in populations where there's evidence of weathering, but in the United States, African Americans have had the longest history this oppression and racism. And so weathering is just almost fundamental in America to African Americans, given our systemically racist society.
Mm. Well, it was interesting. After you answered that question for me, I ended up in West Virginia trying to see how, the most marginalized white folks would be weathered. Can you talk about their experience?
Yes, I've done studies in Appalachia, as well as among urban poor whites, and they weather too, and especially in Appalachia. In fact, if you look at the probability, which we did look at, this is not just some hypothetical, the probability that a 16-year-old will survive to be 50 years old and able-bodied, something most of us take for granted, and in fact is probably 90% likely for the average American, in both places like Appalachian, Kentucky, where I've done work, and the south side of Chicago, the poorest areas of the south side of Chicago, those chances of and be able-bodied are a mere 50%. And that is a testament to weathering and to this premature aging and all the harm that's done to people's bodies. And money, to some extent can avert death or as early a death because of its access to medical care and food and safe housing and all the various things money can buy, but money can't buy whiteness. And so it doesn't buy you out of weathering. And what we have seen is in many more affluent communities, life expectancy isn't as short as, say, in Appalachia for white people, but the degree of morbidity, the length of the time of their life where they spend disabled or with health-induced disabilities and other chronic conditions, or we saw in COVID infections, they spend a much larger part of their life sick than their white affluent counterparts, who have not been weathered but lived to the same age.
Mm-hmm. I was giving a talk recently, and I was talking to a group, and I mentioned weathering. Everybody's really excited. I held up your book, which I'm going to do in a second, and I told the story of Postville, Iowa, and one of the Latinx students came up to me, and she was in tears to say that she really felt seen by that. What happened and how it was sort of beyond Black and white. So can you talk a bit about the work you did in Postville, Iowa, and then what you learned?
Okay. As probably many audience members are aware, but in case you're not, in 2008, there was the worst ice raid on in this case, a slaughterhouse and meat packing plant than there had been in American history anywhere. It was completely militarized. About 900 ICE agents just descended by surprise. It was militarized. There was like a Black Hawk helicopter. All the ICE agents were heavily armed with automatic weapons, and they just arrested en masse about 400 workers who they presumed were undocumented immigrants, Mexican Americans who worked at the plant. Now, I want to be clear. While many were undocumented, nobody was arrested as an individual known to be undocumented. It was just this, idea, this kind of racial profiling, if you will, that if you work at a meatpacking plant and you look like you're Latinx, you must be an undocumented worker. And so these people who in fact were actually largely from Guatemala and Mexico, though some were from Israel, they really did not identify individual people and none of them had commit previous crimes, and none of them even had, as it turned out, had committed the crime that they were accused of, but they were still arrested. The men were shackled and herded to a cattle congress where they were, pushed down cattle chutes and all arrested in groups, arraigned in groups. So nothing was done on an individual level. Women were sent to local jails, and if they had kids, they were allowed to go home, but only wearing ankle monitors. So it was a pretty stressful, acutely traumatic experience. And so what we found when we studied women who were pregnant during this at the time of this raid is that Latina women across Iowa, not just those in the raid, not just those married to people in the raid or relatives of people in the raid, not just those who were undocumented, people who were American citizens and green card holders. Latinx women who were pregnant during that time had, for the 9-month period afterwards, a 25% increased risk in having preterm or low birth weight babies. So the question is, what has happened? You could understand why that might happen to people who experience this trauma firsthand. And that would be a part of weathering all on its own. But what we came to believe about why we saw this across Iowa and only among Latinx mothers, the white mothers, there aren't a lot of Black mothers in Iowa, but the white mothers in Iowa, their rates of these poor birth outcomes continued to actually decrease over this time period. But the Latinx mothers saw this major increase. They had actually had lower rates of those poor birth outcomes before the raid. So that's also very striking. And what we found was that news of the raid spread very fast throughout Iowa and Latinx communities in particular. And this led to a lot of vigilance and fear and trauma and concern on the part of women all over Iowa. Was this going to happen to them? Were they going to be, even if they were documented, were they going to be just assumed to be undocumented? Did they have people, relatives who might have been in the raid or might be in a future raid? They were afraid to, they all started to avoid public space. They all started to save money and not spend money, take their kids out of school so that they would, not try to minimize their risk. They were also discriminated against by employers who were afraid of this happening at their, places of business. And so for all these reasons, it's completely sensible to realize that they were also under this structurally induced stress arousal, even though they were not there at the raid, but because they had an identification or could worry that other people with no good in mind would make assumptions about them that would put them in harm's way. And what I also like to point out when we talk about postville is that, postville and pregnancy lent itself to a pretty tight quasi-experiment to very quickly see if the postville raid had these kinds of impacts, because babies are born within 9 months. But this probably did not only affect pregnant women. This probably, in terms of its weathering and corrosive properties, may have affected Latinx men in Iowa, Latinx children, women who weren't pregnant. We just could see the clear and quantifiable manifestation of it in women who were pregnant.
Right. I want to talk about what happened to you earlier in your career. So, I know your story, and you started looking around at this around teen pregnancy. And then you found out that it wasn't, there was this whole, I showed my students the campaign, the teen pregnancy campaigns that were on the subway in New York City. It was like the harshest thing. It was like, people were blaming infant and, infant mortality on teens having babies. And so what you found was that it was actually slightly older women who were having the, worse birth outcomes. And then you were blamed for sort of encouraging teen pregnancy. Can you talk about that crazy period in your life? Was that in like the 90s?
Yes. Well, you might be bringing up post-traumatic stress disorder, but I'll try.
Don't
it's okay. It's okay. It's a long time ago now. Yes. I found that in the populations where teen childbearing is common, which are very select populations, both in terms of ethnicity and poverty, that having children in your late teens led to better birth outcomes than at any other age. And as early as in your early 20s in those populations, the rates of, I initially studied neonatal mortality, but I've since studied all sorts of poor infant outcomes and also maternal mortality. And this figure, this image or trajectory is clear in any outcome and any time over the last 35 years, because that's how many generations I've studied this in. You have better chance of a healthy reproductive outcome if you're in your late teens than in your 20s if you're in an oppressed and exploited or high poverty population, an impoverished population. And but it was when I presented these results at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, journalists who were there took hold of it, and some who were advocates also who were working with these campaigns that, like you saw on, there was just a total moral panic about teen motherhood at that time, and especially Black teen motherhood. They wrote stories and newsletters and talked on TV and radio. There weren't podcasts yet. That I was wanting to keep all Black teenagers barefoot and pregnant, and that I was encouraging teen childbearing, and that I thought our official policy should be to promote teen childbearing. That never crossed my mind. To me, those findings, along with other aspects of them, showed that we needed to figure out why Black mothers were experiencing such dramatic and even life-threatening health problems as early as their 20s. What do we have to do to make it safe for women to have kids in their 20s or 30s who are under these conditions? Not we should promote young people to have kids, but we should make the world safe for all women to have kids when they want to. It's a matter of reproductive justice. And until we could do that, we certainly shouldn't be preventing teen childbearing so actively. We should be affording everybody access to reproductive freedom. And most teenagers will avail themselves of contraception or abstinence or what it takes to plan pregnancies for a later age. But those who were having their kids young didn't have all the opportunities that you're supposed to postpone childbearing in order to fulfill. And meanwhile, they were aging and they were going to have less healthy babies, be less healthy themselves, be likely to orphan their children young, or to have them live with their parents having prolonged disability if they waited to the kinds of ages, especially to the late 20s or 30s that advocates were pressing for.
Right. Well, I was struck by how harsh the attack was. I mean, you were getting hate mail and your university, to your home, and all.
I got death threats.
Yeah.
And there were op-eds in major papers about, how I was carrying on the master's work to keep Black teens barefoot and pregnant. There was, my favorite headline, favorite in quotes, was "Research Queen says let them have babies." And it was also just very, very sad that they were missing the real point and not giving me, they were sort of gatekeeping. Journalists and advocates can do this. They can kind of gatekeep the greater public from learning new ideas that might at first seem odd or threatening or counterintuitive. Right. And they were actively doing that. And I wrote the book because 30 years later, I not only have so much more evidence, but also because all the things that preventing teen childbearing was supposed to make better in terms of health have gotten dramatically worse, especially among Black women.
That's right, including maternal mortality.
Absolutely, including maternal mortality.
And you know what I also notice is that once, COVID happened, people started reaching out to you to say, wait a minute, because COVID, and what did you think? Like, what was happening at that time? Because I noticed, people were talking about COVID and its relationship to age, and Black people were having worse health outcomes at younger ages. And I thought to myself, oh, this is what Arline said. But then I noticed, others were saying that. Did you notice that?
Yeah, well, and also people became quite receptive to learning about weathering because of how it helped piece together that puzzle, which is, there are several structural reasons, some of which are more obvious than others, why people of color were getting COVID and dying of COVID younger than white Americans. And the obvious ones were, since they were the quote essential workers, they couldn't work remotely. They couldn't go to their vacation homes to work. They couldn't, stay in their luxury apartments or even just nice suburban houses. I mean, they had to go to work. They often lived in overcrowded housing with, multi-generational housing. And so surely they were more exposed to COVID. But that didn't explain why so many more died from COVID. And at young ages, where white people who were getting COVID were not dying or even often needing to be hospitalized or getting severely ill. And that's where I think weathering plays into it, because if you have a already dysregulated or weakened immune system, for example, you will not be able to fight weathering as well. And if it's dysregulated, you may even
wait.
Those are not our kids.
My kids are way too old to sound like.
I wish they're all too old.
Cute and adorable sounding. But that could cause the cytokine storms that led to overdrive immune systems, that led to kind of autoimmune eating of people's lungs and hearts, which for many people was what precipitated their deaths. That would be a classic outgrowth of having a weathered immune system. People understood that people over 65, that was a real risk factor and they were the most likely to die. But if you think about weathering, you realize that Black and brown bodies are likely to be as physiologically aged as a 65-year-old 10, 20, even 30 years earlier.
Mm-hmm. I want to encourage people to ask questions in the chat or the Q&A in the Q&A. So please put your questions. I see one. I'm going to ask one more thing, and then I'm going to turn to that Q&A question. I think you're amazing. And I talk about weathering a lot. And, a lot of Black women say to me, oh my God, what do I do? How do I, Black people say to me, how do I survive if there's so much here? And that, and it's hard to, it's a thing that's happening to you, even when you're trying to do your best. So what do you say to people to say, how do you weather the storm?
They can't do it alone. The ultimate responsibility for disrupting or eliminating weathering has to be a societal project. And what I have, obviously, getting your physicals or exercising or all the things we're all told to do, there's no harm in that, and it may be helpful. Finding out if you have hypertension at a young age or diabetes, because these are silent, especially in the early stages, and can be managed to some extent, sometimes very successfully if they're caught early. But it's not an individual behavior thing you can do. I have seen many people have talked to me about the relief they felt learning about weathering, and how it took a whole layer of sort of stress and guilt off of them. And that's one less biopsychosocial stressor. So I do think knowledge of weathering, while in some ways is kind of scary and daunting, it can also have some positive effects on its own. The other thing, which you know about as well or better than I do, is if you're pregnant, it really does speak to working with doulas or having home births or delivering in a safe space, or overriding some physician discretion about how protocols that will actually help make the delivery safer than what they think will help make the delivery safer. And also being prepared for these births. In terms of the hospital, for example, until people noticed a spike in maternal mortality over the last several years, they didn't even have crash carts nearby maternity wards that could be used in the case of a sudden hemorrhage or stroke or heart attack, which are leading causes of maternal death. Now, more and more hospitals have at least done that. So there are ways things are being made safer. But the big issue, even with maternity care, is we don't have enough providers, let alone enough providers who are doulas or midwives as opposed to OBGYNs. We have sort of one maternity care provider for about 15,000 births on average. And then that's not evenly distributed in rural areas, many high poverty rural areas. There are no maternity providers. And we have denigrated the work of midwives and doulas for centuries. The American Medical Association did it very explicitly. And so it's going to take a little time for us to have the workforce we need to fulfill some of these recommendations, but that's something we should be doing. We should be increasing coverage of doula care and midwives, training of them, and incentivizing them to be working in underserved areas.
That's right. I love that. I'm going to take a few questions. The first is, thank you, Julie Fox, for asking. And she asked, how can you separate and prove the difference between the effect of weathering versus the social determinants of health?
The social determinants are part of weathering, so they're not really separable, but I think the social determinants way of looking at things is a little too limited and will not result in eliminating weathering, because the social determinants tend to look at specific and separate, very important issues: income, housing, environmental racism. So I am so glad people are at least talking about social determinants. When I began my career, no one was talking about social determinants. But they've been conceptualized very often as separate from each other, or you do one thing at a time, or as demographic risk factors or behavioral risk factors. I mean, they've sort of been sort of dropped into the paradigm we already have of individual risk. And that is, you know, what weathering is about is overlapping and intersecting systems of oppression, and being put between a rock and a hard place, as we've discussed, that whatever you do, it may help you in some ways be healthy, and it may in other ways undermine your health by exacerbating weathering. We need to take this on in that holistic way. We need to have all of society involved, and we need to have the people who have had this as lived experiences be part of the decisions about what a health impact statement should say, what policies we should pursue. It's just amazing how much the actual lives and risks of people in oppressed populations have been ignored, misrecognized, or just completely erased from public conversation and policy conversation. So I am a little worried that with the social determinants approach, it will, at best, it will not be enough. And it may even lead to the wrong policies or to kind of a performative approach, because you use the term social determinants, or you have a thing like a racial impact statement before you do your policy. But if that racial impact statement isn't informed by the actual socially situated knowledge of people who are the real stakeholders and victims of weathering, then you could have all the health impact statements or racial impact statements you want, and you're not going to eliminate weathering.
Yes. I have another question. You kind of answered it, but it was talking specifically about maternal mortality. It was saying how high maternal mortality rates are affected by weathering. I think we kind of answered that. And what kind of policies would counteract the weathering that happens to, birthing people? I guess, it doesn't always, it happens during pregnancy. It happens during labor and delivery, and it also happens in the 42 days or even the year after a baby.
Like 50% of maternal deaths are after the delivery and throughout the next 42 days, depending who's counting the deaths versus year. But so first of all, besides the kinds of things I've already talked about, the doulas, the crash carts, the just understanding who's at risk, we also have to think about supportive family policies for people who have had babies. For that, some people are talking about, we should talk about a fourth trimester of pregnancy for those 3 months after birth as a time when we need to give extra support and attention to women who have just given birth. There's no country like ours that doesn't have at least 3 months of maternity leave, for example. There's no country, and some have as much as 2 years, and most have somewhere between 3 months and a year. There isn't the assistance with childcare. There aren't family or childcare allowances. There aren't. Most other developed countries and many less developed countries have all sorts of policies in place to help support women after childbirth and their families, whereas we guarantee no paid maternity leave, and we just expect, and we kick people out of hospitals very early, and we provide no family support, and then they're back at their high-risk jobs, becoming exhausted. At the same time, they're trying to deal with a new baby and a new family role. And so it increases stressors for these birthing people or already birthed people. And so we've gone about things completely the wrong way. And we've seen the maternal mortality rates have gone up for everybody in the US, but they're highest for Black women, they're highest for Black working class women, but they're also incredibly high sort of at the rate of maternal mortality for for white women who didn't finish high school, no matter how well off or affluent you are, they're high and going up for Black women. And that's just a human rights violation. And no other, all at the same time in all the other developed countries, Western countries, whatever we want to call them, maternal mortality rates have been going down.
Right. Another question is about the sort of medical training and sort of for the training for doctors and nurses and midwives and people who are taking care of providers. Like how do you talk to them about weathering and what can they do in their role about the effects on people?
Well, this is really just a matter of reproductive justice, and there's a lot of there's some social movements and local grassroots groups, and also committees on an ACOG, American
College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists.
Thank you. I kept trying to think what the C was, and it wasn't going to be association, but college. Who are embracing some of these ideas and trying to advocate for them to be possible, which again has to include things like different reimbursements, different insurance coverages, different mix of maternity care providers and many more care providers, a different training, so that care providers are more attuned to the idea that for any woman, but certainly for Black women, the delivery room is not experienced as a safe place. And when it's not experienced as a safe place, you're in these physiological arousal during delivery. You may already be weathered and stressed by other things, but and I always come back to actually an example you gave in your New York Times Magazine article of a young woman whose heart rate, I think, was blood pressure is going way up, and her baby was in fetal distress, and it was subsequent to the anesthesiologist having screwed up her anesthesiology and also made her doula, she actually had a doula, leave the room during this time. And that sort of, in some sense, freaked the young woman out, understandably. The doula, when she was allowed to return, as I recall, encouraged her in soothing ways to first kind of name what she was so angry and stressed about from what the anesthesiology had done, and then tell her to move on. And to lavender thoughts, if I remember correctly, because her favorite color. And in minutes, her blood pressure was down and the baby was no longer in fetal distress. Yeah. So that, our maternity care providers who aren't doulas, trained in helping people to calm down and think nice thoughts and feel reassured after something terrorizes them in the delivery room. Not yet, but they need to be.
Yeah. The last question is, how do we use the evidence and research of weathering to make social change, to demand action, to get lawmakers who may not be sympathetic to marginalized communities to make a difference?
Well, I hope we can use it in ways that have that effect. One of the reasons I wrote the book is I think people are stuck in narratives, and especially politicians and policymakers, that think there's just a developmental answer, that there's a right age to have children and a wrong age, or that if you have difficulties in your pregnancy or bear a low birth weight baby or have a real crisis in delivery, that it's something you did or didn't do. You didn't eat the right things during pregnancy. You didn't, and part of even the developmental idea is that teens and young, and now women even in their 20s are being accused of that they're not able to look to the future enough to care about their baby, and they're too narcissistic or impulsive or, you know, to do the right things during pregnancy. I think weathering suggests that's not what's happening, that in fact it can even be the opposite. People are trying to do all the right things, and that the trajectory of maternal mortality risk, of course, is influenced somewhat by reproductive developmental factors, but the huge increase and disparity among Black and other oppressed and exploited women compared to white birthing people, even at the same age, isn't only a matter of reproductive maturity or senescence, or what, you know, that it's all of these other factors that have added to the deterioration of their health and make it much more risky to have babies at older ages. And in that sense, I also think we have come to think, and I think, as you know, we see this as the liberal viewpoint, that postponing childbearing is a great feminist thing to do, and postponing it into your 30s. And we're also told we can do that. And if we're having some trouble because of infertility, we can get reproductive assistance technology, or we can get freeze our eggs when we're young and then have our kids at 40. All of that is oversold and will not work for most people, and nobody is told that part. But also in that interim, there's so much weathering that goes on in some populations, and there's also greater health problems in any population as they age. So we need to think about how we can make, and this is reproductive justice, it healthy and possible and socially acceptable to have kids when you want to have kids, whether that's when you're 19 or 25 or 30, whether you've finished all your education or not, or make it possible to raise kids while you're going to college or while you're doing your internship. I mean, we've made it so impossible and even glorified the idea of postponed childbearing till the late 30s and even 40s. That just doesn't sit with trying to eliminate health equities, promote health equity, and promote the health of mothers and children.
Exactly. I am going to hold up your book, which I have. This is the one where I haven't marked it completely up. But this is Weathering. It came out yesterday. It was released Tuesday. Yeah. And congratulations. And please, get this book. It's really good. There's a lot of people who are curious about these issues. Everything is answered here. I'm going to say to you, person to person, it was much more political than I expected. And I loved that. Congratulations. Thank you for being in conversation here. And, I'm so proud of you and so glad that this book is out in the world.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both so much. This was such a fantastic conversation. And thank you to all of you at home for spending your evening with us. You can support the author and our store by ordering the book through harvard.com. The link is in the chat. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, keep reading and be well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. See you, Arline. See you soon.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye, Linda. Thank you.
That's great.